Somewhere within 30 miles of where you're sitting right now, there is a man whose entire job is to stand at a gate in a fluorescent vest and make sure that a truck full of crushed refrigerators is not quietly giving off gamma rays. That's it. That's the job. He watches a set of gray pillars on either side of a scale, and if a light on those pillars turns from green to red, he stops a 40-ton load of scrap metal and calls the state. Most of those men will go their whole careers and never see the light change. They still show up. They still check the batteries. Their industry pays for those pillars, because about once a decade, somewhere in the world, a little piece of metal the size of a grain of rice gets loose from the place it was supposed to live, and it kills people who never learned its name. I'm Nathan, and I want to tell you about the month a man like that lost his mind slowly, in a hospital hallway, because his 8-year-old daughter kept falling asleep at the dinner table, and no one could tell him why. He had spent 19 years being the person who catches the invisible thing before it reaches a house. And the whole time, the invisible thing was already in his house, sitting in a little gold heart against his daughter's collarbone, where he had kissed her goodnight every single evening for 31 nights. The thing I want you to hold on to as we go is this. Nothing in this story hurt that little girl in a way anyone could see, smell, hear, or feel. Not one symptom pointed anywhere. That is not bad luck. That is design. Somebody chose that necklace precisely because a child is the one thing in this country that nobody ever scans. The gate at Pruitt Metals and Salvage opened at 6 in the morning, and by 6:15, Nolan Pruitt had already walked the line twice. He was 41 years old, built like the back half of a pickup truck, and he had the specific kind of patience you only find in men who work with things that are heavier than they are. His grandfather Ansel had bought the 11 acres along the Little Tippecanoe in 1961, when Merrow, Indiana still had 2 foundries and a rail spur. His father Gil had put in the first crane and the first ledger book, and had died in the office chair at 58, with a cold cup of coffee going scummy beside his hand. Nolan had been 22, and he had not so much inherited the yard as been fallen on by it. What most people in Trumbull County did not know about Pruitt Metals was that it was, in a small and unglamorous way, a checkpoint. Every load that came across the scale passed between 2 portal monitors, gray fiberglass columns about the height of a man, packed with plastic scintillator, watching for gamma. Nolan had installed them in 2011, after a hard month he did not like to talk about, and he had gone and gotten himself certified as the yard's radiation safety officer, which meant 3 days in a windowless hotel conference room in Indianapolis, learning about isotopes from a man with a laser pointer and a dead tone of voice. Most scrap men treat the monitors as a nuisance. Nolan treated them like a smoke alarm in a house with a sleeping kid in it. He logged every alarm, including the ones that turned out to be a load of granite countertop, or a guy who'd had a heart stress test that morning and was still faintly radioactive from the tracer. Sully Bodecker, his foreman, 58, a beard like steel wool, 3 fingers on the left hand, and no story he'd tell twice about it, used to say Nolan was the only man in Indiana who'd stop a $100,000 shred for a countertop. Nolan would say, "One day, it won't be a countertop." He had a wife, Simone, and a daughter, Clementine, and if you had asked him at any point in the previous 9 years whether he was a lucky man, he would have said yes without having to think about it. Simone Pruitt, née Fenomore, was 38, and had a way of walking into a room and rearranging the temperature of it. She had been an appraiser since she was 22, which was a nice way of saying she had worked for her mother since she was 22. Her mother was Rosalind Fenomore. Everyone called her Roz. She was 66 years old. She wore her hair in a short silver crop and her reading glasses on a chain, and she owned Fenomore Estate Buyers, which was the kind of business that exists in every county in America and that almost nobody thinks about. When somebody dies and the children live 4 states away and nobody wants to spend 3 weekends sorting through a dead man's garage, they call a company like Roz's. She buys the entire contents of the house, sight unseen-ish, for a check, and then it becomes her problem and her profit. Roz Fenomore had built that into an 11-employee operation with a warehouse out on County Road 400 and a reputation for being the fastest closer in 4 counties. She could stand in a dead stranger's living room, look at 40 years of accumulation, and give you a number in 11 minutes. She was charming in the exact way that a good salesman is charming. which is to say that being liked by her felt like a small achievement, and that was the trick of it. Her son Dane ran the trucking side, 3 box trucks and a flatbed, Fenomore freight painted on the doors in a font that cost more than the paint. Dane was 44, loud, an arm-around-the-shoulder guy, and the kind of man who tells you he'd give you the shirt off his back in a tone that makes it clear he's expecting the shirt back. Her younger daughter Ivy did the online listings and the estate auctions, and that was the family Nolan Pruitt had married into. Warm, loud, in each other's business, at each other's houses 4 nights a week. He had liked it, at first. He'd grown up in a quiet house with a father who communicated through the medium of handing you a wrench. The Fenomores hugged. They shouted about nothing. They showed up. Clementine Pruitt turned 8 on the 12th of April. They had it at the Fenomore house because they always had everything at the Fenomore house. 22 people in a backyard, a folding table of casseroles nobody would eat, and Clem in a paper crown running a lap of the whole yard every 4 minutes like a wind-up toy. She was a serious kid mostly. She counted things. She had a notebook where she wrote down the license plates of cars that parked on their road, which Nolan found hilarious and Simone found faintly alarming. Roz gave her present last. That was a habit of hers, and everybody knew it, and everybody let her have it. It was a small box, and inside the box was a necklace, a fine gold-colored chain, and a locket shaped like a heart, about the size of a nickel, with a little engraved border of leaves around the edge, and a soft, warm shine to it that made it look older than it was. Clem made a noise Nolan had never heard her make before. She was not a girly kid. She was a kid who liked rocks and license plates. But she went absolutely still, and then she put her hands over her mouth. "It's a real one," Roz said. "It's from a lady's estate up in Kerwin. It's older than your mother. It's got a little catch on the side. No, sweetheart, don't force it. It's stuck. It's been stuck for 50 years. That's how you know it's real." She put it on Clem herself, standing behind her, with her chin near the girl's ear, and she fastened the clasp and turned her around and held her out at arm's length and said, "There, now you're somebody." Nolan took the photograph. He has that photograph. Roz's hands are on his daughter's shoulders, and the little gold heart is sitting in the notch of the girl's collarbone, catching the 4 o'clock light, and everyone in the frame is smiling, and it is the last picture of his daughter before. To understand how the necklace got on his daughter's neck, you have to understand what Fenomore estate buyers actually was, and Nolan did not understand that until much later. The clean version is the one on the website, compassionate, discreet, full-service estate liquidation. The real version is that there are 3 kinds of things in a dead person's house. There are the things anyone can sell: furniture, dishes, the Buick. There are the things that need a little paperwork: firearms, some coins, the occasional taxidermy. And then there is a third category that most estate buyers touch once and never again: the professional leftovers. A dentist dies and there are 200 grams of dental amalgam and a benchtop x-ray head in the basement. A retired chemistry teacher dies and there's a cabinet of reagents that the fire department would like a word about. A doctor dies and there's a lead-lined case in the garage with a radiation trefoil on it that nobody in the family has opened since 1988. And everybody in the family assumes it's empty. And half the time, everybody in the family is wrong. Most estate companies will walk past that stuff. It's regulated. Disposal costs money. Real money. 5 figures sometimes. And it's traceable, because when you hand a sealed source over to a licensed disposal outfit, your name goes on a form that lives forever in a federal database. Roz Fenomore did not walk past it. Roz Fenomore had figured out somewhere around 2009 that the professional leftovers were the highest margin category in the entire business, because there is always a buyer. Collectors want the old radium clocks, and the uranium glass, and the antique fluoroscope. Prop houses want the lead cases. A certain kind of hobbyist on a certain kind of forum wants a check source. And there is a whole gray market of small industrial outfits who would very much like to buy a working radiography camera off a stranger for $8,000 instead of buying it legally for $40 and having their name attached to a license. She was careful. She was always careful. She did not advertise. She sold to a handful of long relationship buyers, cash or wire, and Ivy scrubbed the listings, and Dane's trucks moved things at night, and none of it ever touched the storefront. In 16 years, she had never had a problem. Nolan knew none of this. He knew his mother-in-law bought dead people's houses and sold their coffee tables. He had loaded a truck for her twice. What he did know, what he had lived through, was the thing that made him put the pillars up in the first place. In February of 2011, a load of shredded medical equipment had come into the yard from a hospital demolition in Ohio, and the shredder had gone down for 4 hours, and the crew had gone home early, and it wasn't until the next morning that a state inspector, doing a routine visit at a downstream mill, found a hot spot in a bale of shred that had come out of Merrow. The math on that one had come out in Nolan's favor. A capsule had been in a bale that sat in his yard for 19 hours, and nobody had gotten near it. 19 hours and 40 feet, and the number the inspector read off his meter meant nothing at 40 feet, and would have meant everything at 4. Nolan had gone home that night, sat on the edge of his kid's bed. Clem was a baby then, still in the crib, and understood a thing about the world that he had not previously understood, which is that the dangerous stuff does not announce itself. It does not glow. It does not smell. It does not hum. There is no version of a human being that can detect it. The only reason anybody catches it, ever, is that somebody spent money on a machine and somebody else agreed to actually look at the machine. He bought the pillars that spring. He got his certification that fall. And for 14 years he had been the man at the gate. Clementine's necklace never went through the gate. She wore it to the yard twice that April. Nolan brought her on Saturdays sometimes, let her sit in the crane cab and pretend. But children do not walk across the truck scale. They come in through the office door on the other side of the building, where there are no pillars, because why in God's name would you put a radiation portal monitor on the door your daughter uses? That is the whole story, right there, in one sentence, if you want it early. The machine was 50 feet away the entire time. The first thing was that she got tired. Not sick tired, not fever tired, just tired, the way a kid is tired at the end of a long swim day, except it was a Tuesday and she hadn't done anything. Simone found her asleep on the floor of her room at 4:40 in the afternoon on the 18th of April, still wearing her shoes, her library book open under her cheek. They laughed about it. Growth spurt, Simone said. She's 8. She's growing. She'll eat us out of house and home next. The second week, her teacher sent a note. Clementine had fallen asleep during silent reading twice, and had asked to go to the nurse once because she felt heavy. Nolan read that word about 40 times. Heavy. The pediatrician saw her on the 24th. Ears clear, throat clear, lungs clear. A little pale, maybe. Mono was going around the 3rd grade. He drew blood, told them the lab was slow this time of year, told them to push fluids and let her sleep, and said the sentence that every parent in America has heard, and that is right about 95% of the time. Kids get like this. Give it 2 weeks. The rash showed up on the 28th. Simone saw it first, in the bath. A patch on Clem's chest, high, just below the throat. An area maybe the size of a $50, pink going toward red. The skin faintly shiny, not raised. Not weeping. And here is the part that Nolan would think about for the rest of his life. It did not itch. Clem said so plainly when they asked. She said it didn't hurt and it didn't itch. It just felt tight, like when your face is sunburned but only in one spot. They tried the obvious things. They changed her detergent. They took her off the strawberry yogurt. Simone put hydrocortisone on it, and it did precisely nothing, which is unusual for a rash, and is also the kind of unusual that nobody notices. And when the pediatrician looked at it on the 2nd of May, he wrote, "Contact dermatitis, ROO nickel allergy," and asked whether she had any new jewelry. She did. Of course she did. And this is the piece that makes Nolan's jaw go tight even now. Because a competent doctor asked exactly the right question in the 2nd week and still got the wrong answer. Because everybody in the room, including Nolan, gave him the answer that made sense. Yes, a necklace. Yes, she wears it constantly. Yes, it might be cheap metal. Take it off for 2 weeks, the doctor said. If it's the nickel, it'll fade. Clem cried. Clem, who did not cry about things, cried about the necklace, and said she'd take it off at night. And Simone, because she was tired, and because it was her mother's gift, and because it was a heart on a chain and not a loaded gun, said, "Fine. At night. That's the deal." It came off at night. It went back on at 7 in the morning. And the reason it came off at night matters, and I'll come back to it. Because that single stubborn negotiation between a mother and an 8-year-old is the only reason this story does not end in a small casket. The blood work came back on the 5th of May and it was not normal. Her white count was low, her platelets were low, her hemoglobin was drifting. The pediatrician's office called and used the careful voice, and the word that came out of the phone was hematology. And Simone sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the dishwasher and did not get up for a while. Meanwhile, the family reacted the way that family reacted, which is to say, enormously, loudly, and in a way that made it very difficult to think. Roz was at the house within an hour of the phone call. She brought food. She brought a legal pad. She had already looked up the 3 best pediatric hematologists in the state and had already decided which one they were going to see. And she had already called the man's office at 4:50 on a Friday and gotten a Monday appointment, which was genuinely impressive and which Nolan was genuinely grateful for. Dane put $150 of gas in Nolan's truck without being asked and wouldn't take it back. Ivy set up a meal train. They were, in every visible way, a family closing around a hurt child. And Nolan noticed exactly one wrong thing in all of it, and he did not know he had noticed it until 6 weeks later. On the evening of the 5th of May, standing in his kitchen while Simone cried, Roz Fenomore had asked one question that was not about the doctor and was not about the blood counts. She had said, "Is she still wearing my necklace?" And when Simone said yes, at school, off at night, Roz had nodded once and had not said another word about it and had gone back to the legal pad. The clasp broke on the 17th of May. It broke at school. The spring bar in the lobster clasp gave up, the way a cheap clasp on a 50-year-old chain does. And Clem came home holding it in her fist inside her jacket pocket like a bird she'd caught. She was hysterical about it in the specific desperate way of a kid whose whole life has recently become doctors and needles and grown-ups whispering, and who has one object left that is entirely hers. Nolan said he'd get it fixed. He said it that night, at the edge of her bed, with the little heart sitting warm in his palm, and he told her it'd take a day, maybe 2, and she made him promise, and he promised. Sarkeesian and Sons had been on Vine Street in Merrow since 1961, which was the same year Ansel Pruitt bought the 11 acres, and Emil Sarkeesian was 68 years old and had inherited both the shop and his father's opinions about how a thing ought to be done. He had a bench in the back under a north window, and a jeweler's loop he'd been using since 1979, and a policy of never, ever quoting a price before he had opened a thing up and looked inside it. Nolan came in on his lunch break on Monday the 19th of May. He remembers there was a Sox game on a little radio, and Emil did not turn it down. He put the necklace on the velvet pad. He explained about the clasp. He said, "Offhand, the way you do, and if you can get the locket open, that'd make her year. It's stuck. Been stuck since before she got it." Emil turned the locket over in his fingers. He weighed it in his palm, and he did a thing with his eyebrows. "That's heavy," he said. "Is it?" "For a locket." He didn't explain. He put the loopy in. He worked at the seam for a minute and a half with a thin blade, and it gave with a small hard click, and the back plate came off in one piece. And Emil Sarkeesian stopped moving. He did not gasp. He did not swear. He put the blade down on the velvet pad, very carefully, the way you set down a full glass. Then he took the loop out of his eye and set that down too, and he pushed his stool back about 8 inches from the bench, and only then did he look up. "Who gave this to your daughter?" he said. Nolan said something like, "Her grandmother. Why?" And Emil did not answer him. He picked up a pair of long-nosed tweezers, and he did not touch the object with them. Instead, he used them to slide the whole necklace, velvet pad and all, 6 inches further away across the bench. Then he said, in a voice that had gone completely flat, "Mr. Pruitt, do you see the inside of that back plate?" Nolan leaned in. The inside of the back plate, the part that had sat against his daughter's skin for 31 days, was not gold. It had been hollowed out and lined with a dull gray metal, thick, dead-looking, filling almost the entire cavity, and set into a drilled recess in the middle of that gray metal, held by a dab of clear epoxy. was a little cylinder, about 4 millimeters long and 2 across, silvery, machined. It had markings on the end, tiny and precise, the kind of markings a hand does not make. "That gray is lead," Emil said. "My father put lead in watch cases in 1958 for the radium dials, so the men in the shop didn't take it home in their hands. I know what lead in a case looks like. I have not seen it since I was a boy, and I never expected to see it again." He was looking at Nolan and not at the bench. "There is a lead cup in the back of your daughter's necklace," he said, "and there is something sitting in it. And the lead is on the outside, sir. The lead is between the thing and the world. It is not between the thing and her." Nolan Pruitt had spent 14 years being the man at the gate. He had sat in the windowless conference room in Indianapolis. He knew, in that instant, in a way that arrived in his body before it arrived in his mind, exactly what he was looking at. Not the specific isotope, not yet, but the shape of it. A sealed source, shielded on 5 sides, open on the 6th. Pointed at a spot the size of a $50, just below a child's throat. He said, later, that the room did a thing where the sound went out of it. He said the Sox game kept playing and he couldn't hear it. Emil Sarkeesian reached under the bench and came up with a small steel box. He kept it for gold dust, and he did not put the necklace in it. He said, "I'm not touching that again." And then the old man said the 8 words that ended one life and started another one. "Sir, go to the police, right now." Nolan did not go to the police. I want to be careful here, because it sounds like a criticism, and it is the opposite of one. He did not go to the police because he had spent 14 years learning a thing that most people never learn, which is that a police officer in a county of 31,000 people cannot help you with this. There is no procedure. The dispatcher does not have a code for it. The best case is a very polite young deputy standing in a jewelry shop looking at a locket, saying, "So what do you want me to do with it?" And the honest answer being, "Nothing. Don't touch it. Get someone else." Nolan went 4 miles east instead, to the only building in Trumbo County with a calibrated survey meter and a lead pig. He drove with the velvet pad on the passenger seat and the windows down and his hands at 10 and 2, going about 30 and a 50, and he says that was the longest 4 miles of his life. He called Sully from the road and told him to clear the office and to bring the Ludlam and the pig out to the scale house. And Sully, who had worked for 2 Pruitts and had never once heard Nolan's voice do what it was doing, said yep and hung up. The Ludlam meter came up out of its case. Nolan set the necklace on the concrete at the edge of the scale house, backed off 15 feet, turned the meter on, watched it settle to background, and then walked toward it very slowly, with the probe out in front of him, like a man checking a floor for a hole. At 10 feet it moved. At 5 feet it climbed. At 1 meter, the standard distance, the number he'd been taught to think in, the number that lives on every form he'd ever filled out, the meter read a number that he read 3 times because the first 2 times his brain refused to convert it into anything. He would tell an assistant U.S. attorney, 11 months later, that he had never once in 14 years read a number like that with his own hands, and that the sound he heard was Sully saying his name from 30 feet back, and the thing he thought was not a thought at all. It was an image. It was his daughter asleep on her side, curled, the way she slept, with the little heart tucked into the hollow of her throat, 8 hours a night, and then not 8 hours a night, because Simone had made the deal about taking it off at night. The deal about taking it off at night. He put the necklace in the lead pig with a set of 3-foot tongs off the wall, and he sealed it, and he moved the pig to the far corner of the empty east lot, and he set a cone next to it, and then he sat down on the gravel and put his head between his knees and breathed for a while. Then he stood up and started making phone calls, and by the 3rd one he was the man at the gate again, and he never really stopped after that. The state came at 11 that night. 2 vehicles, 4 people, and a man named Vaughn Ledbetter who introduced himself as the regional inspector for the Radiation Control Division, and who shook Nolan's hand with both of his. By then, Clementine was already at the Children's Hospital in Indianapolis, because the pediatric hematologist Roz had gotten them in with Dr. Farah Nasrallah, 46, direct to the point of bluntness, the best thing that happened to that family all spring, had taken 1 phone call from Nolan at 4:15 in the afternoon, and had said the following: "Stop. Say the last part again." He said it again. She said, "Bring her now, not tomorrow, and bring the photograph of the rash, and tell them at the desk it is a radiation exposure. Use that phrase exactly." So they paged the right people. The thing about Dr. Nasrallah is that she had already been bothered. She'd looked at Clem's labs on the 12th and had not liked the pattern. A viral suppression looks a certain way. This looked like something was leaning on the Merrow and had been leaning for weeks. She'd had a differential going in her head that included a couple of terrible things and one thing she had never seen outside of a textbook. And when Nolan said the word lead and then the word cylinder, her hand was already moving toward the phone. The identification took 11 days and came back from a lab in Tennessee, Iridium 192. A sealed industrial radiography source, the kind that lives at the end of a flexible steel cable inside a heavy yellow camera and gets cranked out to shoot X-ray film through the wall of a pipe weld and gets cranked back into its shielding before any human being goes near it. Its serial markings were still legible on the capsule end. It had been manufactured in a facility in Washington State and sold, legally and on paper, in 2019 to an industrial services company in southern Indiana that had gone under in 2022. And it had a half-life of 73.8 days, which is the number that ended up putting 4 people in federal prison, and I'll get to why. The days after are a blur in the telling, and were not a blur in the living. The state took the yard's east lot for 9 days. The house on Delcamp Street was surveyed room by people in white suits with wands, and they found the ghost of it, elevated readings in exactly 3 places, and one of those places was the top drawer of a small white dresser in a little girl's room, which is where a necklace goes at night. That was the deal Simone had made. Off at night, in the drawer, 4 feet from the bed, and behind 2 layers of particle board. Dr. Nasrallah told them later, in the flat voice she used when she had decided you deserved the truth, that the 8 hours a night of separation was very likely the reason they were talking about a Merrow that was suppressed and recovering rather than a Merrow that was gone. A third of the exposure removed. A third. Clementine Pruitt spent 19 days in the hospital. She had a burn on her chest. That's what it was, and that's what nobody had said for a month. A radiation burn, sharply bordered, exactly the diameter of the open face of a lead cup. And the burn got worse before it got better, the way they do, weeks after the thing that caused it is gone. Her counts bottomed on the 3rd of June. She got 2 transfusions. She got a Hickman line that she named Gary. She lost some hair on one side and thought that was the funniest thing that had ever happened to anybody. She asked her father, once, on the 9th day, whether the necklace had been a bad necklace. He said yes. She asked whether Grandma Roz knew. He said, "That's what I'm going to find out." Here is what he actually already knew, sitting in a vinyl chair at 3 in the morning with his hand around his daughter's ankle through the blanket. He knew that Iridium 192 does not wander. Cesium wanders. Cesium ends up in scrap because it gets built into gauges that get scrapped. Iridium sources are different. They are cranked, logged, wipe-tested, and inventoried by the hour because they are the most dangerous portable object on a job site. When one goes missing in this country, it is a national event within about 6 hours. There are teams. There are aircraft with detectors. Nobody was looking for this one, which meant nobody had reported it missing, which meant it had come out of a company that no longer existed, and it had come out quietly, and it had spent 3 years somewhere. He knew that the capsule had been machined out of a source assembly. You do not do that by accident. Somebody had held that pigtail with a tool and had separated the capsule from the cable, and whoever did it had at minimum understood that the thing needed to stay behind lead while they did it. And he knew that a hollowed-out lead cup, drilled to a precise recess and epoxied into the back plate of an antique locket, is not something that happens to a piece of jewelry. It is manufacturing. Somebody had spent an evening at a bench with a rotary tool and a caliper and had built a container. That was the part he could not get past. Not the source. The workmanship. Somebody had sat down at a bench and had thought carefully about how to make a hiding place, and had chosen a locket, and had chosen a child. The family's version arrived within 72 hours, and it was good. It was really good. It's important to say that, because it's how these things actually work. Roz Fenomor's version was that she had bought a lot at an estate in Kerwin. She had the paperwork, she had a signed bill of sale, she had a photograph of a dining room full of boxes. The necklace had come out of a jewelry box in that lot, along with about 40 other pieces. She had cleaned it herself with a cloth. She had never opened it because it wouldn't open. She was 66 years old and she did not know an iridium from an orange, and she was going to be sick every day for the rest of her life about what she had put on that child's neck. And she cried. And it was not fake crying. That's the thing Nolan needed people to understand. Roz Fenomor's grief was completely real, because Roz Fenomore genuinely loved her granddaughter. And both of those things were true at the same time as the third thing. Dane got loud. Dane got loud in the hospital corridor on the 11th day, close enough that Nolan could smell the coffee on him, saying that his mother was 70 years old. She was 66, and that Nolan was accusing her, and that this was what he did. He made everything into an inspection, everything into a form. He was the guy who stopped a shred for a countertop. Simone did not know what to do. That is the honest and unflattering truth about her in this stretch, and she has said so publicly since. Her daughter was upstairs with a line in her chest, and her mother was downstairs weeping in the lobby, and her husband had gone somewhere behind his own face and would not come out, and she did the thing that a person in the middle does, which is nothing, for 18 days, badly. And Vaughn Ledbetter, the regional inspector, was extremely helpful right up until he wasn't. He was helpful about the yard. He was helpful about the house. He filed the incident. He coordinated the transfer of the capsule to a licensed facility. He answered Nolan's calls. And every time Nolan asked him about the provenance, where did it come from? Who had it? What's the chain? Ledbetter said a version of, that's going to take time, and we have to be careful not to get ahead of the facts. On the 23rd of June, Nolan asked him a specific question. Had the division ever inspected Fenomore estate buyer's warehouse on County Road 400? Ledbetter said, why would we? They're not a licensee. Which was true, and was also exactly the kind of true that a man says when he has already thought about the question. Nolan Pruitt was not a detective, and he was never going to out-investigate the federal government. What he was a man who had spent 14 years filling out forms about numbers, and there was one number in this whole thing that nobody else was looking at. 73.8 days. Iridium-192 decays fast. That is the entire reason industry likes it, and the entire reason it is such a monster. It is intensely active, and then it isn't. Every 74 days, half of it is gone. In a year, it is down to about 3% of where it started. A source that is dangerously useful for radiography in January is a paperweight by the following winter, which means that a capsule of Iridium-192 is a clock. It is not a clock you can stop, or wind, or set. It is the most honest clock in the world, because it does not know it is being read, and it has never once been wrong. Nolan had two hard measurements. He had the activity of the capsule, measured by the state lab on the 21st of May with a calibrated instrument, and he had the capsule's original manufacturing certificate, because sealed sources have serial numbers, and serial numbers have certificates. And the certificate says exactly how many curies were in that capsule on the day it was sealed in 2019. You do not need to be a physicist to see where this goes. If you know how much was there at the start and how much is there now, the decay curve tells you how many days are in between. Nolan did it on a legal pad at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a scientific calculator, and then, because he did not trust himself, he drove to Purdue and paid 90 minutes of a health physicist's consulting time and had her do it independently. The capsule's activity on the 21st of May put its manufacture at 1,406 days prior, plus or minus about 9 days. That matched the certificate to within a week. The capsule was real, the certificate was real, and the source had gone missing from a defunct company's inventory sometime after August 2022. That part was interesting. The next part was the one that mattered, because Nolan had a second, independent clock, his daughter's chest. A radiation burn is a dose meter made of skin. Dermatologists and health physicists can look at the depth, the timing of onset, and the progression of a localized burn and reconstruct, within a range, how much dose the tissue took. And Dr. Nasralla's team had documented Clem's burn obsessively, with photographs and measurements, From the 28th of April onward, 21 days of documentation before anyone knew what they were documenting. Take the reconstructed skin dose. Divide by the measured activity of the capsule with its geometry. A known distance, a known opening, a lead cup on 5 sides. You get exposure hours. The number came out to somewhere between 740 and 900 hours of contact. Clementine had gotten the necklace on the 12th of April. She was in the hospital on the 19th of May. That is 37 days. At 16 hours a day of wear. School, home, off at night. That is 592 hours. The math said she had worn it longer than she had owned it. Nolan sat with that for 2 days. And then he understood. And when he understood it, he walked out of his kitchen and threw up in the yard. The capsule had not been sealed into that locket for Clementine. The locket had been in service before Clementine. The extra hours belonged to somebody else's chest. Haley Fenomore was 15 years old, and she was Dane's daughter, and she came to the yard on the 11th of July on a bicycle she was too tall for, and she stood at the gate until Sully went and got Nolan. She said, "I need to show you my brother's box." Booker Fenomore had died in 2018, at 12 years old, of what the family had always called leukemia, and what had actually been, on the death certificate, aplastic anemia with a secondary infection. Nolan had never met him. He had married into a family with a grief-shaped hole in it and had been told, gently, early, that they didn't talk about Booker much, and he had respected that the way you do. Hallie had been 8 when her brother died, and Hallie had kept, the way a kid does, a shoebox. In the shoebox was a Cub Scout neckerchief slide, and a school ID, and a Ziploc bag of 9 river stones, and a photograph of a skinny, grinning boy at a lake, and, at the bottom, in a fold of paper towel, a small heavy disc about the size of a silver dollar, gold-colored, with an engraved border of leaves around the edge. He called it his lucky coin, Hallie said. Grandma gave it to him. He wore it on a lace around his neck for like a year, and then he got sick, and Mom put everything in a box, and I took the box. She had ridden 4 miles to give it to a man her father had told her not to speak to, and she had ridden with the coin in her jacket pocket against her ribs, and when Nolan understood that he made her put the jacket in a bucket and drove her home himself, and then called the state from the truck. The disc read hot. Not like the capsule, 1/100th of it, less, but hot, and the isotope was different, and the shape was the same, a drilled lead cup and an epoxied recess, empty now, its passenger long gone, but the walls of the recess had been sitting against a source for long enough to have become faintly activated and contaminated themselves. The same hand had made both of them, the same rotary tool, the same epoxy, the same little engraved border of leaves that Roz Fenomore bought by the gross from a wholesaler in Providence. That was the night Nolan Pruitt stopped trying to get someone to help him and started building the thing that finished it. The Y arrived in pieces over about 6 weeks, and it was worse than any of the versions Nolan had invented at 3 in the morning. He had assumed money, some kind of insurance, some kind of inheritance, some ugly arithmetic about a trust. That's what a person assumes, because that's the only reason we can imagine for a grown woman to hurt a child. The truth was logistics. When you buy a sealed source out of a dead man's garage, you own a problem with 2 properties. It is worth a great deal of money to a certain kind of buyer, and it cannot be stored. It cannot sit in a warehouse, because gamma goes through walls and a warehouse full of employees becomes a slow-motion crime scene, and because a properly shielded container that could hold it is 140 pounds of lead that looks like exactly what it is if anybody ever opens a door on it. It cannot go in a bank box. It cannot go in a storage unit, because a storage unit is a fixed location, and fixed locations get searched. A sale takes time. A buyer goes quiet for 3 months. A wire falls through. A middleman gets arrested in Ohio, and everybody sits still for a season. And during all that time, the thing has to be somewhere. Roz Fenomore had figured out that the safest place in the United States of America to store a radioactive source is on a child. It is mobile, so it is never in a place that can be raided. It is shielded on 5 sides by a lead cup that costs $11 to make, so anything scanning from the side or behind reads almost nothing. It is small and gold and boring, so no adult ever looks at it twice. And it is worn by a person that no security system in the country is designed to interrogate. There is no portal monitor at an elementary school. There is no wand at a birthday party. A truck gets scanned. A container gets scanned. A load of scrap gets scanned by a man in a vest at a gate. A 7-year-old at a Cub Scout meeting does not get scanned, ever, by anyone, anywhere. They called it, in Ivy Fenomore's inventory spreadsheet, the cold shelf. There were 11 items on that spreadsheet across 9 years. Most of them were harmless. Uranium glass, a radium clock, a fluoroscope shoe fitter out of a dead shoe store in Terre Haute. 4 of them were not. And the column marked location, which for most rows said things like Bay 3 or Kerwin or sold Bay 3, picked up, had 2 rows in it that were different. One row, dated November 2017, said B. One row, dated April 2025, said C. Simone Pruitt found that spreadsheet. Not Nolan, not the FBI, not the state. Simone, in her mother's business, with her own login, on the 4th of August, at 9:40 at night, after 11 weeks of not being able to look her husband in the eye. She read the whole thing twice. Then she exported it, and she photographed the screen with her phone as well, because she had spent 16 years learning from Roz Fenomore exactly how documents disappear. Then she drove to the hospital, where her daughter was doing an outpatient count check, and she sat in the parking garage, and she called the number on the card that Special Agent Marisol Quintero had left on her kitchen counter in June, the card Simone had thrown in a drawer, while saying the words, "This is a witch hunt," out loud to her own husband. Agent Quintero answered on the second ring at 10:15 at night. Simone said, "My brother's son, the row that says B, that's my nephew. He died." Here is the part where Nolan Pruitt stops being a victim in this story. Because the federal case, as of the first week of August, was in trouble and everybody involved knew it. They had a source, they had a locket, they had a burn on a child. What they did not have was a single piece of evidence that put the capsule into Roz Fenomore's hands. The Kerwin estate paperwork was real. Her story was airtight for the simple reason that most of it was true. The spreadsheet was devastating, and it was also, an assistant U.S. attorney explained patiently, a document with initials in it that a good defense attorney would turn into Bay 3 and crate inside of an afternoon. They needed the rest of the cold shelf, because there was more of it. The spreadsheet had 2 open rows, 2 items bought in 2024 out of the defunct radiography company's liquidation, unsold, location blank. And Roz had them somewhere, and she was never, ever going to move them while a federal investigation was breathing on her. So Nolan gave her a reason to move them. It took him 5 weeks to build, and it had 4 parts. The first part was an offer. In September, Pruitt Metals ran an advertisement in the Trumbo County paper and mailed 900 postcards. A free 2-week commercial cleanout promotion, no tipping fees, free hauling, cash paid for ferrous and non-ferrous, businesses only. It was a real promotion. Sully ran it. It cost Nolan $11,000, and it made him about 4, and it pulled in 22 businesses in the county, including a church, a bowling alley, and 2 machine shops. It was, on paper, a man trying to keep his yard alive during a bad year. The second part was Dane. Dane Fenomore's trucking company was hemorrhaging, because Fenomore Freight had lost 3 contracts in June for reasons everyone in the county could guess at. Nolan let Sully offer Dane the hauling subcontract on the cleanout promotion. 22 jobs, cash on delivery, no questions. Dane took it in about 9 minutes, and told his mother he'd taken it, and told her he'd taken it because Nolan was desperate and stupid and drowning, which was exactly the story Nolan had spent 5 weeks making true. The third part was Vaughn Ledbetter, and this was the piece that made Agent Quintero laugh out loud when Nolan explained it to her, and then stop laughing and say, "Do it again slower." Nolan had known since June that Ledbetter was leaking. He had tested it twice. Small things, a date, a claim about the yard's east lot, and both times the information had come back to him inside a week through the family. So in September, Nolan called Vaughn Ledbetter in a state of visible panic and told him, in confidence, colleague to colleague, that the division's records request on estate liquidators was going to be executed on the 14th of October, that it covered warehouses, and that he'd heard they were bringing mobile detection. None of that was true. It was a story Nolan wrote and handed to a man he knew would deliver it. Ledbetter delivered it in 4 days. And the fourth part was the gate. Because here is what nobody in the Fenomore family had ever once thought about. In all their years of moving things at night, Nolan Pruitt's scale, like every scrap scale in the state, sat between two gray fiberglass pillars. And those pillars did not only alarm, they logged. Every pass, time-stamped, with the gamma count profile and the vehicle photograph and the weight, into a database with a state reporting hook, because Nolan had set it up that way in 2011 and had been feeding it faithfully for 14 years, which meant that his logs were not a homemade recording, they were a maintained, calibrated, court-admissible instrument record with a 14-year chain of custody behind it. On the 9th of October, at 11:40 at night, Roz Fenomore did what a careful person does when she believes she has 5 days. The clean-out jobs had given the Fenomores a legitimate, boring reason to be moving loads to a scrapyard at odd hours all week. Dane's box truck had crossed Nolan's scale 11 times in 6 days already, empty and full, and nothing had happened, because there had been nothing on it. On the 9th, Roz drove out to the warehouse on County Road 400 herself at 10 at night, and she and Dane took a 140-pound wooden crate out of a false floor under the pallet racking in Bay 3, and they put it in the box truck, and they drove it to a place they had used before, a family mausoleum in the old section of Merrow Memorial, where Fenomores had been interred since 1908, and where nobody on earth was going to look inside a sealed granite drawer. The route from the warehouse to the cemetery is 11 minutes. There is exactly one sensible way to drive it at night, because the county road bridge over the Little Tippecanoe was out for deck repair all autumn. That detour goes past the gate at Pruitt Metals and Salvage. Nolan did not sit in his own scale house that night. Agent Quintero was very clear about that, and he did not argue. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of a closed feed store 2 miles east with Sully, and Sully brought a thermos, and the two of them said almost nothing for 4 hours. At 11:47 p.m., the west pillar at Pruitt Metals logged a gamma profile off a passing vehicle at a distance of about 22 feet, with the camera capturing a white box truck, Indiana plate, Fenomore freight, in a font that cost more than the paint. The alarm went to Nolan's phone, and to the state's system, and, because Quintero had spent 3 weeks getting the paperwork right, to a laptop in a car that had been sitting behind the cemetery's maintenance shed since 8 o'clock. They did not stop the truck. They let it get all the way there, and they let Roz Fenomore unlock the mausoleum with her own key, and they let her and her son carry the crate up the 4 steps into that little granite room in the dark, and they photographed all of it. The last piece of evidence in the case against Rosalind Fenomore, the one the assistant U.S. attorney used to open her argument, was a still frame of a 66-year-old woman in gardening gloves and a headlamp, sliding a crate into the drawer beneath her own husband's name. The crate held 2 capsules in a lead-lined ammunition can, and a rotary tool, and a bag of 11 unmade lead cups, drilled and waiting, and 41 gold-colored lockets and discs, with an engraved border of leaves, bought by the gross from a wholesaler in Providence. 41. That number is the reason the sentencing hearing in Indianapolis the following June took 2.5 hours instead of 40 minutes, because the defense argued, correctly, that only 2 of them had ever been used. And the judge, a small, unhurried woman named Judge Priscilla Vantrease, said, in the only part of the whole proceeding that made the wire services, that she was not sentencing a woman for what she had done to 2 children. She was sentencing a woman who had ordered inventory for 39 more. Roz Fenomore was convicted on 11 federal counts, including unlicensed possession and transfer of byproduct material, conspiracy, and 2 counts under a statute about dispersal devices that the government had never once applied to an estate liquidator, plus the state's charges of neglect of a dependent resulting in serious bodily injury, and, in the matter of Booker Fenomore, reckless homicide. She is 68 now. Her earliest release date is in 2049. Dane Fenomore took a plea in February and testified. He got 19 years, and the thing that broke him on the stand was not the cross-examination. It was being shown the photograph of his own son at the lake, which his own daughter had kept in a shoebox for 7 years. and being asked to read aloud the row of a spreadsheet where the location of a sealed source was recorded as the letter B. Ivy Fenomore, who had typed that spreadsheet and had never once asked what the letters meant, got 40 months and a permanent bar from ever holding a fiduciary license. Vaughn Ledbetter, regional inspector, resigned in November before the indictment landed and was convicted in the spring of accepting gratuities and obstruction. He had taken, over 6 years, a total of about $31,000 and a bass boat. He got 6 years. Nolan attended that sentencing and did not speak, and told a reporter outside only one sentence. He was the machine. He was supposed to be the machine, and somebody bought him. Fenomore Estate Buyers was dissolved. The warehouse on County Road 400 was surveyed by a federal team over 9 days and cleared. The buyers on the other end of the cold shelf, an outfit in Kentucky and a man in Ontario, were rolled up over the next 2 years. And Clementine Pruitt got better. Not immediately and not easily. Her counts came back over 11 months. The burn on her chest resolved into a pale, shiny oval about the size of a $50, which will be there for the rest of her life, and which she has been entirely unbothered by since approximately the 6th grade, where she was briefly the most interesting person in her class. She is 13 now. She still counts things. Last spring, she won a regional science fair with a project on background radiation, in which she measured her own house, her school, 3 granite countertops, a bag of potassium salt substitute, and a banana, and the judges made her explain the banana twice. Simone and Nolan are still married. It took 2.5 years and a marriage counselor in Lafayette, and Simone testified against her own mother for 11 hours over 2 days, and there are 4 Fenomores who have not spoken to her since, and she has said that she'd do it again, and that she still can't drive past her mother's old house. Hallie Fenomore is 21. She lived with the Pruitts for the last 2 years of high school. She is studying radiologic technology at Purdue, which she says is not a metaphor, and which everybody knows is a metaphor. Nolan Pruitt still opens the gate at 6 in the morning. But there's one more thing he did, and it is the part of this whole story that I think about most. In 2027, he took the $11,000 the county paid him to settle a nuisance claim, and he added his own money, and he bought a used mobile survey van and a set of handheld detectors, and he started a thing that he named after a boy he never met. The Booker program runs 11 Saturdays a year, out of a parking lot, in a different Indiana county each time. It is free, and it is stupidly simple. You bring in anything you inherited that you don't understand. The box from the garage, the case with the symbol on it, Grandpa's rock collection, the old clock, the thing from the estate sale, and a technician sweeps it in front of you in 90 seconds and tells you what you have. 94% of the time the answer is nothing. It's a rock. They have found, in 4 years, 2 radium clocks, a jar of pitchblende, a fluoroscope tube, 1 legitimately alarming thoriated welding rod collection, and, in the summer of 2029, in a coffee can, in the trunk of a Buick, in a church parking lot in Delaware County, a sealed cesium source that a family had been storing in a hall closet for 19 years. The technician who found it was a man named Sully Bodecker, who is 71 and has 3 fingers on his left hand. They put a sign on the side of that van. It doesn't say anything clever. It just says, "Bring the object." So that's the story. And here's what I keep coming back to. Every single person in this story who was supposed to catch it did their job. The pediatrician asked about new jewelry in week 2, the exact right question. The hematologist looked at a blood panel and refused to be comfortable with it. The parents took her in, changed the detergent, followed the instructions, took the necklace off at night. Nobody was lazy, nobody was stupid. And it still took 31 days, because every one of those people examined the child, and not one of them examined the thing. That's the takeaway I'd hand you, and it's smaller and more useful than check your family for murderers. If somebody you love gets sick, and there is an object in the story, something new they wear, something new in the room, something they got recently and use constantly, bring the object, put it in the bag, take it to the appointment, say the sentence out loud. This showed up right before she did. A doctor who is handed an object will look at it. A doctor who is only handed a patient can only look at the patient and the patient is downstream of everything. The other thing is about the clock, and I'll leave you with it. Iridium-192 has a half-life of 73.8 days. That is a real and beautiful piece of physics. Whatever was in that capsule was, on a fixed schedule, becoming less. Roz Fenomore was counting on that. Her entire plan was built on the arithmetic of a thing quietly getting smaller while nobody looked at it. But there is no half-life on what a person does. It does not decay on a schedule. It sat in a shoebox under a 15-year-old girl's bed for 7 years at full strength, and the day she rode 4 miles on a bicycle to hand it to a man she'd been told not to speak to, it was every bit as strong as the night it was made. Roz measured everything correctly, except that. I'm Nathan. Go look in the garage, and if you find something with a symbol on it you don't recognize, don't put it in the trash and don't put it on a chain. Call somebody. And whatever else you do, if a kid you love gets tired, and then gets a rash that doesn't itch, in exactly one spot, in exactly the shape of something they're wearing, you already know what to do. Bring the object.